Well, today in the podcast, it's all about navigating travel to the United States and navigating the food store to buy Canadian. I'm Marcy Markusa, and this is Manitoba. So let's start in the grocery aisle, shall we? Because if you've been adjusting your grocery store shopping to buy Canadian products because of the U.S.-Canada trade war, you may have learned very quickly that it is not that simple. Here's an exchange between CBC's Matt Humphrey with Winnipegger Rob Nutting.
Oh, look, these guys already have Canadian flags. Have you noticed that a lot of products all of a sudden have Canadian flags on them?
That's perfect. Made with Canadian wheat.
There you go.
So now we know. But is it made in Canada? Yes, it is. Made in Canada from domestic and imported ingredients.
There you go.
And imported ingredients, though. Mm-hmm. So that's a bit of a sticky wicket. If some of the ingredients in this pasta are not produced in Canada, is that breaking the rule of buying 100% Canadian products? Even though it is clearly made in Canada.
Well, how much time does everyone have to figure all these things out, really?
Well, that's the cost of being patriotic at the grocery store.
So that's a conversation captured, I imagine, maybe you've had in the shopping aisle. What do we need to know if we want to fill up our grocery bags with products from our country? Well, Evelyn Soo is here to help us through some of the questions. She's the Executive Director of the Food Safety and Consumer Protection Directorate. That's the body that's in charge of much of the policy and regulation around our food. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Very lovely to be here.
I'm grateful you're here, Evelyn. So why don't we just start with the comment we just heard when you see that little Canadian flag that a lot of, it's being added to the shelves. Does that actually mean anything? And who's actually making the decision to put that little flag up?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question. So the little flag can mean a various number of things, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a product of Canada or the ingredients are purely Canadian. So if you see a little maple leaf with a circle on it, on your products, being meat products or fish and processed egg products, this is usually what you would be calling as an inspection legend. And what this means is that the product has been made in accordance to the food safety laws in Canada in a facility that is located within our country. So the law is the Safe Food for Canadians regulations. So the logo itself does not necessarily mean that the food is containing meat, eggs, or fish from animals that are raised, slaughtered, or processed in Canada. Sometimes you also see a Canadian logo on, for example, organic food. And that means that it meets the Canadian standards for organics. And probably more often so, if you look at, for example, apples and other fruits and vegetables, you will see labeling such as Canada Fancy or Canada A. And what that means is that they actually meet a special food grade in Canada, and they basically provide you information with on the quality requirements that you should expect. For example, the flavor, color, or size of the product.
So if I want to buy something that is actually made with Canadian ingredients or effectively made by Canadians here, what kind of language might I be looking for on my packaging?
Yes, that's very, very a very good question. I would say the product of Canada or made in Canada labeling are the two pieces that you would like to look for when you're buying a product. So Product Canada is actually quite simple. What this really means is that the processing and labor are Canadian and a significant amount of the ingredients are Canadian. There's no official logo for products of Canada, so you really want to look for the words Product of Canada on food labels. For Made in Canada, this is a little bit different because what it refers to is that the last substantial transformation of the product occurred in Canada. So to give you a sense of what this really means, I want you to think about a pizza. So all these ingredients to make a pizza, whether it's like the cheese or the flour, the dough, the sauce, the spices, they are being used, they can be imported and being used to make into a pizza here at home in Canada. So that is what we call substantial transformation, having those ingredients to produce the pizza at the final end. And when you see a Made in Canada claim, it's very important to look for the qualifying statement because this will tell you if all the ingredients are or are imported, or if it's a combination of both imported and Canadian ingredients. For example, you may see made in Canada with imported and domestic ingredients on the label.
Because I'm glad you explained that, because I was going to ask about made in Canada, product of Canada, packaged in Canada. Kraft is a big example as well, because Kraft is owned by a U.S. company, but it does employ workers in Montreal. They do use, I believe it's 70% Canadian ingredients across the market, but not 100%. So people are trying to figure out where the dollars are going. Do you think there's a need now maybe to have things be, I don't know, more stringently regulated so consumers can trust that they're buying Canadian? I'm going back to those little flags on the shelf, because a lot of people go and they presume that those flags mean, okay, this is the one I'm going to take. But if you don't understand the nuance of what we're talking about, or do you regulate who can put those flags on the shelf already, Evelyn?
So I think we have to know that the labeling is actually voluntary labeling. And it really helps. It's really the decision of the business owners to determine whether or not they want to put the little labels on the food. So it's really a grocery store decision.
A bag of Ruffle chips has a Made in Canada stamp, and I understand that to get that, is it right that it has to be at least 51% goods or labor that are, the labor's done in Canada over 50%, or the goods? Is that what gets you that stamp?
So I think that refers more to other products. We don't. Our guidance really just has to make sure what you have on the label is truthful and not misleading. So to really be able to explain what it contains, whether it's ingredients of imported ingredients and domestic, and actually, if you wanted to, for the claims, you can actually specify, for instance, if something is 100% Canadian wheat, to really differentiate what part of those are domestic ingredients versus imported.
How do you navigate this on your own grocery trips?
Oh, this is a really, really great question. I've always supported Canadian, and I always try my best to find products that are labeled as product of Canada or made in Canada. It's really, really important that we support our businesses and our local producers. So this is a priority for me. The CBIA website, actually, they really recognize that this is a very important topic for Canadians. And we recently posted a quick reference guide with visuals on our website. So if consumers like yourself and want to quickly check and see what these products label mean, I would suggest that they download this on the phone. It's very easy. Access the site on the phone, and they can verify what do we mean by a product of Canada, and to really inform them on the purchasing decisions.
Super valuable information, Evelyn. Thank you very much for your time today.
No worries. Elbows up.
That is Evelyn Soo. She's with the Food Safety and Consumer Protection Directorate. And if you want to find the website, by the way, that she was talking about there, and you want to identify those Canadian food products that she mentioned, we found the easiest way to navigate this is by Googling how to identify Canadian food products. That's going to get you to the Inspection Canada website, and it is inspection.canada.ca. Well, this is Manitoba, and I mentioned that today's podcast has a lot of navigating in it, because one of the other things that you might be thinking about is, what do I need to have on me if I'm traveling to the States? Well, that's a question if you're simply traveling, but what if you're a snowbird? What if you're going for an extended amount of time for business down to the United States right now? There are some things that you might want to know about. Canadian snowbirds, for example, could choose to nest somewhere else thanks to an executive order that was signed during Trump's first days in office. Now, this is a new law that states that Canadians have to register with the American government every 30 days they are in the United States, or you could face civil and even criminal penalties. It kind of flew under the radar because there was uproar, of course, about the changes around tariffs and gender laws and abolishing government DEI policies. But we wanted to hear more about this. So Rhys Pactican is next on the podcast. He's a Winnipeg-based immigration lawyer. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Marcy.
So what does this mean for Canadian snowbirds? Walk us through this.
Well, so any Canadian that's going down to the United States, this rule, once it's fully implemented, assuming it's going to be fully implemented, because we've seen things change back and forth with the American administration, requires registration if you're staying in the United States for more than 30 days. So it's not going to affect a Canadian traveler who's going down for a short trip. It's not going to affect anyone who's going down for an extended trip if you're going down for work or study, because most of those individuals have to apply well in advance or at the border for a status, and they'll get some documentation that shows that they're registered. So it's really going to be looking at individuals who will be going down for tourism purposes for extended periods of time.
So does
And
that mean, I'm going to interject there for a second, because if you rent or if you own, or there's distinctions there?
it appears to be with respect to individuals who will be in the United States. So regardless of purpose. So the two groups that would catch would be people that would be staying for more than 30 days, either for tourism or business purposes, who aren't registered. One of the ways that you can check if you're registered, because sometimes it's almost automatic, or it's not quite automatic, but you don't actually know that they've done it, but you can find out that they've done it, especially if they've gotten your passport, is you can check if you have what's called an I-94. There's an online tool that the U.S. government has for that. You enter your passport information, and if it appears that they've issued you an I-94 when you go through that, then you know that you've been registered. If there is no I-94, so if you enter your information and nothing pops up, then you know that you haven't been.
Who's registering you, and do you have to ask for that?
Well, so if you're going down for a business purpose, normally the process of making that application will automatically cause you to be registered one way or the other. If you're going down as an international student, normally that process will also cause you to be registered. It's when you're going down as a tourist, or if you're going down as a business visitor, so not someone who's going to be working there necessarily regularly, but maybe a short-term status that doesn't require the full work permit type of thing, then sometimes you can be registered and sometimes you won't be. But this requirement requires you to be fingerprinted as well. So you're going to know if your fingerprints were taken. I mean, it's not the old days when you've got ink on paper. It's the electronic stuff. And so you'll know that if you haven't been fingerprinted, then you've likely haven't been registered.
Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, though, the if you're past 30 days, you have to be re-registered. So if someone's thinking to themselves, okay, hang on a minute, we're going down for a couple of months, maybe you have a timeshare, or maybe you are a snowbird, or maybe you have a business travel, what should people know once they're down there? Because you have to register again after 30 days?
Well, that's not the way I understand it, but again, the full implementation isn't there yet. What the rule was talking about, at least with respect to if you're already there, are people who are already there and not registered. So there's certainly provisions for that to say, excuse me, if you're not registered when you're there, and now you have to register because you're passing the 30 days, go through the process and do that. Normally what happens is they indicate how long you're going to be staying. And when you do that, then you're locked in for that period of time. So let's say that you've got a 3-year work authorization, then you're registered for the entire 3 years. So one of the things, again, that you can check, because the normal registration, if you had one for a visitor, would be through the I-94 system, is you can just check on your I-94 to see when that expires.
And you probably want to, because is it correct you could face civil and criminal penalties?
Yeah, and more than that. I mean, so yes, there's criminal penalties that you can that it attracts, but also it's going to likely be recorded as part of your immigration record. And whether that will prevent you from entering the United States on a going forward basis hasn't quite been determined yet. But at the very least, it's going to be there. And then so if you're crossing into the United States, you give them your passport, they put your passport information in, and they see that there's been a violation, there is going to be a discussion. Now, there's not going to be a discussion if they see a violation from 2025 and it's 2065. But, if you had a violation this week and you're trying to cross 2 months from now, they'll be asking you some questions.
Canadians, obviously, we've been hearing, are already canceling trips to the United States with, the ongoing uncertainty and also the tariff war, of course. How could this impact Canadians spending money across the border, just if we widen out and look at the overall picture here?
Well, as long as you're registered, as long as you comply with the law, there's no restriction on what kind of money that you spend on the border. But the question is are you going to cross? And this is just another thing that people have to consider. And you don't have to look too far back about crossing the border and when it's inconvenient when people didn't do it. Just look at COVID, when there were all of these rules and people just said, I'm just not going to do it. And so yes, this is one rule, and maybe it's not terribly inconvenient in and of itself. It's certainly not, something that's has to be disregarded. But this is another rule on top of another rule on top of another rule. You know, Canadian rules about your Manitoba health, tax rules about how long you stay in the United States before you might have to pay taxes. There's a whole bunch of rules, and if you add another rule, it's not going to make it easier for people, and might discourage people to say, hey, you know what, just don't want to do this stuff all the time, and maybe I'll play, live, work, travel somewhere else.
If I'm curious whether or not you've heard any rumblings that this is affecting people that are already in the States and and working, and whether or not they're worried. And I also wonder whether you have advice for us about, if you are going to the States, would you think differently about documentation you carry or before you go, just given the uncertainty in the climate right now?
Well, I mean, that's one of the things that you have to always think about when you're traveling to another country. I mean, if you're not a citizen of that country, you have to abide by their rules. If you're specifically thinking about this registration requirement, then ask the Border Services officer, ask Customs and Border Protection when you show up at the airport, or when you at pre-clearance, or when you show up at the border, and say, I'm going to be staying for X amount of time. Do I have to register?
Just put it out there.
Just put it out there, because there's nothing.
And you do that when you show up, or you do that in advance?
Well, I think you do that when you show up, because there's not really a way to do that in advance. I mean, you can call them in advance. You can try to talk to them in advance to prepare for it. But generally speaking, just put it out there.
You'd ask.
Because the best policy is to be honest. Because if you're not honest, then that's always a problem. And, they'll be asking you questions. They have to do that. But you should ask those questions as well. I mean, one of the challenges that the border might have is that if there's a large number of people, do they have the capacity to deal with everyone on a timely basis, especially at pre-clearance at an airport? I mean, people are trying to make flights. There's a whole bunch of people. How is this all going to be administered? So that's what I'm more concerned about, not with respect to a rule about registration, but, is it going to be done in a timely fashion? Are people just going to miss it because, U.S. government folks are too overwhelmed and they're inadvertently missed, and then they get into trouble? That's what you don't want to see.
Rhys, thank you very much for being in. Always valuable to have you on.
Thank you very much.
That's Rhys Pactican. He's an immigration lawyer here in Winnipeg. Well, that's our podcast for today. Thank you for tuning in. And remember to follow, like, and share.